early on in my career, I always thought of success as material success, maybe, you earn more, you have the ability to accumulate more. And I just don't think about success that way. The finite nature and the temporary nature of everything is much more palpable and real to me now, more so than ever in my life. And so success to me now is measured more in the impact that I can have on other people's lives. Welcome to the Represent More podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Clarkson.
And I'm your co-host, Shireen Clarkson.
Shireen, it is Monday, May 4th, we're recording. Cinco de Mayo tomorrow, coming off a nice weekend.
Yeah, how was your weekend?
How was my weekend? You were a big part of it.
I was. How did it go for you?
It was good. It was a good weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very kid heavy.
It was.
Right?
Yeah.
With Adia, our 9-year-old. She's a busy little bee, and we were socializing through her and with her.
I went to 2 10-year-old birthday parties yesterday.
That's correct.
Yeah. One at a dance studio and one at the beach. They were nice. They were fun.
Yeah.
The parents threw very nice parties.
Yeah, you did a nice job with your
with what?
With your parenting that day.
My parenting skills were really on
display.
On display yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun. What do you think about the dance birthday party? I like how it's contained, it's active, the kids love it.
Well, Adia is a dancer. She loves dance, so yeah. I'm a big fan.
Yeah.
It's great.
It was a nice little thing they did yesterday. And then at the beach afterward, her friend from school did a nice beach thing. Oh my gosh. One of the relatives of the birthday girl lost her keys in the sand. And for hours.
It became a search party.
It was just a total search party. And just as we were about to give up, and just as Kyle was one of the parents, he's got everything in his garage, right?
Yeah, like Mr.
He showed up with his son's metal detector.
Stop.
He was good. Serious. I was actually really excited about it. I wanted to see how it would all work out.
Yeah.
One of the little siblings found it in the sand. Found the keys like in the middle of the beach.
Wow. What are the chances?
And Zuma Beach is big.
Big shore.
Lots of sand.
Lots of sand. Grains.
Lots of places for a key fob to worm its way into.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a success story.
So that was a nice thing yesterday.
Yeah.
Still high off the excitement of the find. And then on Saturday, you had a full day.
Yeah. Saturday was Adia had a dance performance at one of the schools in Malibu. She did a great job. And then we went to her school, which had a big event called Webster Palooza.
Okay.
It's like a play on Lollapalooza.
Fun festival.
DJ, dancing, raging.
DJ Eddie, I hear, was in the house.
DJ Eddie, proper club DJ.
I also heard unconfirmed rumors about the police shutting down Webster Palooza.
Yeah, it was too loud, but that's Malibu for you. Like a little bit of excitement, and everyone's sort of on alert.
Can't have that.
What's going on? Too much fun around here.
In the mountains and beaches of Malibu.
Yeah.
Very relaxed. Adia had fun, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it was a good weekend.
Cool. Good. Trying to think what else happened over the weekend. Anything else? We've got some big stuff coming up this week.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a good week at Clarkson.
Do you have anything going on for Cinco de Mayo?
We have a dinner tomorrow night.
Okay. We've got a dinner that we're going to.
Yeah.
Unrelated to Cinco de Mayo, though.
Right.
I think.
I assume there'll be some tequila there to celebrate the occasion, maybe.
Do Mexicans even drink tequila to celebrate Cinco de Mayo?
I
don't know.
I believe that they do.
Do they?
I would guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
We should look into that a little bit.
We have a big all-attorney meeting on Thursday of this week.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So the whole firm's going to get together. Well, all the attorneys.
We do that 3 times a year.
Mm-hmm.
One around this time of year, once in the summer surrounding our summer summit, which is like a 2-nighter somewhere um, in Los Angeles. We usually do it at a resort.
Yeah.
Opportunity to connect and
Yeah.
share
Because
ideas.
otherwise we're spread out a bit, right? We've got some folks in LA and we've got folks in other parts of the state and the country. So we like to get together at least a few times a year and connect and talk about all the cases and all the plans for our
Right.
firm. So that's
And then the
happening
holiday
Thursday.
party is the third time we kind of all get together.
Yeah.
It's another big moment for us.
Yeah.
Each
What
year.
else is happening this week? Are those the big?
We've got a big filing on a groundbreaking settlement of one of our big tech cases that will be announced tomorrow. We're filing a motion for preliminary approval, which it's a significant inflection point in the case because it's the first instance in which a settlement is publicly presented to, and ultimately for the court's decision to approve or not. We've put so much work into this preliminary approval motion, and it's going to be very strong. And then that kicks off the approval process where we give notice to the class of the settlement terms so that they can then react to it by either making an objection, well, hopefully they make a claim, or if not, they make an objection or opt out. So those are the ways. And I think this is a great settlement. I don't anticipate any objections. I don't anticipate any opt-outs. So we'll see how it all goes.
Yeah. So we're not talking about any details until the filing. Is that?
Yeah.
That's the plan.
And by the time this airs, it'll actually be, it'll be public.
Yeah.
So maybe we should talk about it. Maybe not. I'll let it go.
Yeah. We'll talk about it next week.
Okay. We'll talk about it on the next one.
Mm-hmm.
Or should we talk about it now? This is going to be one, Dan, where we might have to do a cut or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, it wasn't something that we were planning on discussing, so I think we should just leave it there and cover it on the next one.
Yeah.
But listen, there's that, and then we've got a couple of other things that are really big that are heating up. A couple of cases we're planning to file. More to come on that. You've got some things happening. What about you?
I mean, again, it's cases we're preparing to file, and we can't, we're not quite ready to talk about all the details until we get it filed. So
let's continue to talk about what we can't talk about. Seriously, let's spend another 4 minutes on it.
Yeah, let's get into the topic of the day, which I'm very excited to talk about.
You don't want to get into some medical private information or anything like that we can't talk about? About that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I will not disclose about my medical information.
Yeah, I want to tell you all about the things that I wouldn't disclose about myself. You could just burn the rest of the time this morning on it.
Just alluding to things and not talking about them.
Hey, have you ever seen the SNL skit? I can't remember. I think his name is, oh my gosh, it's played by Fred Armisen.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's like Nicholas Fane or something like that. And he plays this character who says a lot, but never actually gets to a point.
Yes.
And
I know exactly what you're talking about.
I feel like that's what this is all about.
Yes. This is the podcast version of
that. Yeah.
Yeah, that character.
And it's so interesting because as far as podcasts are concerned, this is one of, well, it's not one of, but I'll tell you, listen, zooming out for a moment and just kind of talking about the world in general and kind of where we are in space and time, it makes me think, all right, getting back to Cinco de Mayo, just for a second, if we pause on that for a moment.
That's annoying. I get it.
Isn't it the worst?
It's the worst.
That's what he does the whole time.
Yeah, and that's what we've done. And now we've talked about doing that.
We've talked about doing it, and then we've done it.
Yeah.
What is it that we're covering today?
I love that you asked. We're covering you today.
Really?
Today we're going to talk about you and your get a little deeper into who you are and how you got here. And I think it'll be enlightening.
Okay.
And I think I know most of this information. So, but I'm guessing that there's some little gems you've been hiding from me that you might disclose today.
I've been deliberately deceiving.
Yeah.
You.
So So you want to get
Okay.
into
All
it?
right. Well, listen, it's one of my favorite topics,
I know.
if
I
I'm being
figured you'd be
honest. No,
really
I'm
good at
kidding.
this today.
All right.
So,
We can do that. Actually, we were supposed to make it an interview about you,
and then we
but
pivoted
we pivoted because you weren't feeling it today, were you?
today. Well, today, yeah, we tried to. This morning wasn't the right morning for me.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
to
Well,
get into it. So
we
we
can dive in. I'm happy to share. So, what are we going to get into? Like origin story, likes, dislikes,
yeah. I mean, do you want me to give you a preview of
favorite
everything, or should we
foods?
just jump into it?
No, go ahead. I mean, you're going to be the interviewer,
Okay. Well, I
right?
thought we could start with talking about having you take us back, and you can share a little bit about what kind of kid you were growing up, and
Yeah, I can start
what you
there.
think may have shaped you from your childhood.
Okay. Um, so I was born in Michigan,
Hmm.
and I grew up in Michigan. I lived there for 30 years until I moved to Los Angeles in 2007. As a It was a great place to grow up. Grew up in a big family, four brothers and sisters, and young parents. They're still young relative to me. It's kind of a nice thing of uh, having young parents. Is if all things go well, you have a long life together. And my parents just celebrated last year their 50th wedding anniversary. So they've been together for a long time, and um, grew up in a very warm, loving, supportive household. My father was a factory worker for most of his adult kind of professional life, and worked his way up into a management position and ultimately to a plant manager role. Um, and then my mother was kind of a homemaker for most of my childhood. And then when I got into high school and college, she started managing a hair salon. Um, and, kind of uh, did that for many years. And what else? I don't know. I guess older sister, Jody, and 3 years older, and then myself, and then a sister, Janie, who's a year younger than me, my brother Adam, 2.5 years younger, and then my brother Andrew, 6 years younger than me. So we had
Yeah.
5 kids all compressed into kind of a 9-year time frame.
Hmm.
And so we were all super close growing up, and it was a wonderful way to experience a childhood with
Yeah.
best friends, living under the same roof.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that Midwest upbringing that I've been hearing about from you, and that I've sensed as I've gotten to know people from your childhood and your life.
Yeah, and you've
It's
seen it firsthand. I mean, we do 4th of July every year in Michigan at my brother's house, and you get to see kind of that Midwestern hospitality and sweetness up close and personal. And
Yeah.
um, yeah,
I
it's
love
good.
Midwesterners. They're great.
Earnest,
Good,
hardworking,
hardworking, down to earth people.
moral, strong, constitutions, not overly political or um, you know, um, like reasonable,
Yeah.
salt of the earth people.
Yeah. Did you have any strong mentors as a kid that you looked up to that sort of maybe helped shape who you are?
Absolutely. So I would say I'd start with my parents. My mom was just uh, so supportive growing up. She was always the room mom, the PTA mom, and really was dialed in, knew every single person, every one of our friends' parents, every teacher, um, everyone in the community, the police officers, the firefighters, the postman, the
Mm-hmm.
everyone,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, that's Pam.
Um, that's Pam.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And she taught me to just treat every person, no matter what their situation, background, job, um, socioeconomic status, you know,
Mm-hmm.
what they're about, religion, um, whatever
Right.
it is, treat them the same and treat everyone with respect
Yeah.
and dignity. And that's something that I always thought of and really took to heart. So, and I would say that that's something that is very much a part of me, learned at a very young age from my mom, who's like a fantastic role model. She's also made me feel like I could do absolutely anything in the world. You have those people in your life that they're just your champion and make you feel invincible and make you feel like you can achieve anything you want, and because they've got your back and they're your biggest cheerleader. That's my mom. My dad, hardest working person I've ever known, um, just quietly would go about his kind of business, working 80-hour weeks every year of my childhood, really, and doing work that was very hard work. So, um, and just taught me lessons like always show up, um, you know, follow through on your commitments. Rules like that
Yeah.
that I think have served me very well in
Hmm.
my professional life and my personal life. So, and then of course just shows up whenever you need them, no matter what. My parents always had this rule when I was growing up, which was no matter what, this was for all the kids and all of our friends too. If anyone was ever in a situation, ever in a jam, and needed to be picked up or needed, to be rescued from a situation, you call Pam or Jack, and they would show up. And my dad, would show up at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. It didn't matter where or what the situation was. No questions asked. He would just show up, and off we'd go.
Yeah.
And that was Jack the
I
Ripper.
think I know about one story in particular where he did that for you. Not one to share on this podcast, but I do. Yeah. He was always there when you needed him.
For
That's
sure.
for sure.
Um,
Yeah, that's cool.
I'm not
So
sure which one you're talking about, but there were probably a handful of those
yeah.
moments, that every kid experiences,
Yeah.
where you're like, "Ooh, I don't know." You're in a situation,
Yeah.
and you need to hit the escape hatch, and that was my dad.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
So
your parents are awesome. Um, yeah, as you were talking about that, I was trying to think of something sort of funny to say about, why some of that might not have passed down to you, but it all did. And because I remember thinking that when we first got together, thinking some of those things about you and how unique it is, especially when you're dating in LA, and then you come across like somebody like you and you're like, oh, this person has like real values and is like really down to earth. And, I noticed those things about you. And then I met your parents and I said this in my vows, which was that sort of sealed the deal with you because I saw all those qualities in them that were clearly passed down to you. So yeah, good stuff.
thanks, Mom and Dad.
Yeah.
Thanks for that compliment. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah, it's
No,
true.
listen, it's a testament to them and how they raised us and my brothers and sisters. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. So mom and dad as a couple primary mentors in your life
sure.
makes total sense. So did you have you didn't have any lawyers in the family,
No lawyers in the
right?
family,
No,
no.
that was not really something that you were close to, like a profession that you knew much about or that were close to. So what were you ambitious for as you were growing up and starting to get, come to an age where you were starting to decide what you wanted to do as an adult? What
Yeah,
was your
when I was a kid, I was very serious about school and very serious about sports and very much into extracurricular activities. I kind of wanted to do a little bit of everything. So, I loved to study and I loved to perform in class. And I was someone who was, kind of an outgoing kid in the classroom. I also loved team sports, played baseball since the age of kindergarten, since the age of 5, I think, when I was in kindergarten, and then started basketball at a young age, played soccer. Um, and then my sports in high school were baseball and basketball and soccer. And then I played golf as well. I started caddying when I was in junior high and did that through high school,
Mm-hmm. You played almost every sport except the one that I played and that
which
I play,
was,
tennis.
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You know what? I picked up the tennis racket in high school and would, fool around a little bit, but I
Yeah,
didn't
but it
like
wasn't
really
like,
learn the game.
yeah, wasn't one of your main
And
sports.
yeah, and it's so interesting, right? How if you don't pick up a particular sport when you're a kid, it's harder to find that muscle group and that kind of the swing or the, whatever it is, the stroke,
Yeah, as an
right?
adult. But it's not
As an adult.
impossible. It's not impossible.
No, no, no. So
You've learned tennis. You've picked up
that's right, and
tennis
I'm
recently.
I'm happy to say that I've probably beaten you more times than I've lost to you in recent
I
years.
don't think that's a
Really?
correct
You don't want to turn it
statistic.
into?
No, I'm going to fact check you on that one. That is not right. But you
But I've
are
gotten the better of you a few times.
you have won somehow.
Okay, it's the divorce slice that you told me about.
Yeah.
It's that backhand where you just put it back into play and
Yeah.
just wait for the unforced error on the other side.
Yeah.
Instead of really hitting it back and forth.
Right.
Yeah.
The wonky slices that you send me.
Yeah, I like to play
Drive me-
the small ball.
Small ball.
So I was really big into academics. I was big into extracurriculars and sports. And I would say that, I was cool with everyone socially, all the way through high school. So,
Yeah.
Kind of the more academic, nerdy types, or the jocks, or the, whatever. More kind of like a Ferris Bueller type, I would say, in that kind of a way.
Yeah.
Um,
Good reference for anyone 40 and over. But yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I'm
So, that's probably how I think of myself as a child. And yeah, and then I would say when I got into, so I went to undergrad at, I grew up in suburban Detroit, so about 40 minutes outside of Detroit, a small town called Wixom. I went to Wall Lake Western High School, go Warriors. And
were they the Warriors?
Yeah, we were the Warriors.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, and I'm a big Warriors fan, obviously, Golden State. But yeah, it was a fantastic community to grow up in, really supportive, and so many of the people from my kind of relatively small class by some high school standards have gone on to do unbelievable things.
Mm-hmm.
So successful, Emmy Award winning, TV producers and, doctors and Wall Street, success stories and it's been, people in the music and entertainment industry, super agents and
then you. Brian Clarkson.
And I've been doing my thing too.
Yeah.
So it's nice to see, whatever happened, whatever was in the water at that time, led to some real success stories, and people have kind of gone on and live in the East Coast and internationally and on the West Coast now, all from this small community just outside of Detroit. So,
why don't you talk a little bit about what led you to the law?
Sure. When I was growing up, I grew up in so my mom's dad, my papa, was the patriarch of the family, kind of this larger than life character, Andrew the Kid Peppo. He owned bars and restaurants in Detroit during kind of Detroit's heyday, which is when the Motor City was really, I would say a very significant place between New York and, say, Los Angeles and San Francisco, almost on par with like Chicago, I would say, as a Midwestern center of business and influence. And my grandfather, who was Albanian, his parents emigrated from Albania through Ellis Island, in the kind of early part of the 20th century. And they ended up setting up shop and planting roots in Detroit and got into the bar and restaurant business. And so my mom's dad had this restaurant bar called the Brass Rail. which if you look in kind of historical books of Detroit, you'll find it in there. It was a significant landmark and location. And so he was a businessman. He was an entrepreneur. And he emphasized, and as did my parents, the importance of an education as the great equalizer. It was something that was very big in our family, and he really wanted a doctor in the family. And so from a young age, I was kind of groomed to be a doctor. I was going to be a doctor, and I knew I was going to be a plastic surgeon, and I would volunteer at the hospitals and burn centers. And, I thought I was going to be like a maxillofacial plastic reconstructive surgeon. And reconstructive plastic surgeon. And that's what I was really focused on. I mean, my email address at Michigan was docrjc@umich.edu.
Wow.
I still remember it.
Yeah.
I went through the whole pre-medical school requirements, and somewhere along the way, I decided that it just wasn't for me. Deep in after my senior year of college, I had studied international security affairs, political science in undergrad, kind of in parallel to all the pre-medical curriculum. And, I ended up taking a couple of years off after undergrad and really gave serious thought to my future, and ultimately decided that what I really wanted was to better understand the world around me.
Yeah.
And yeah, I realized I didn't know much about the world. I didn't understand mortgages, and I didn't understand banking and real property and contracts, and the hospital system and our system of politics. And there was so much that I didn't know, but I knew that I was thirsty for the knowledge. And so I thought going to law school would be a real strong foundation for me to develop an understanding of those things. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made, was to go to law school. I ended up going to Michigan State Law School. They had this program that was focused on churning out, hit the ground running trial lawyers, called the Jeffrey Feiger Trial Practice Institute, or TPI. Jeffrey Feiger was a very famous attorney in metropolitan Detroit, had some national coverage for representing Jack Kevorkian, known as Dr. Death, in assisted suicide cases. He did a lot of catastrophic injury cases, and was kind of a giant in the legal community in metropolitan Detroit. And he endowed this program that, was focused on trial law and trial work. And so it was the first of its kind in the country. I was super excited. That was kind of in my own backyard, not far from where I grew up, about 45 minutes away. And so I applied there, got accepted, and ended up getting accepted into that program when I was in law school. And, just a wonderful time of learning and reorienting my understanding of the world.
Okay. Great. So, is there a point at which it became less academic for you? The law became less academic and more mission driven, or, um, was there a point at which
Yeah.
you felt you understood what you wanted to do professionally beyond just the academic?
I would say so. I ended up taking a job at a big law firm out of law school called Dykema. I took a job out of their Bloomfield Hills, Michigan office. Dykema it was a century-old white shoe cherrywood law firm that represented the big three and other big corporations. But because it was a Michigan flagship firm and had roots going back 100 years, they represented Ford and General Motors and Daimler Chrysler, and expanded their kind of automotive work into, Asian car companies, ultimately, and represented a lot of, construction companies in the Midwest and that sort of thing. And I ended up taking a job with them because it was, it felt at the time I was making, I got an offer to make six figures out of law school in 2005. And that felt like life-changing money to me.
Yeah.
It was more money than my father ever made,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm making it the first year out of law school. So it felt like a watershed moment in my life.
Yeah.
And
And in those days, that six figure, even that low, low six figure number was good money. And it still is, but it was
yeah. Oh, yeah.
straight out of law school was like really impressive. I feel like the numbers have moved up a bit,
Oh,
now.
yeah. Listen,
But
it's been 20
it's
years.
been 20 years. So it's even, but at the time, I remember that was like, that's what you were aiming for.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And so it felt just like a different thing. And I was so excited and I was really ready to work. So I took a job as a litigation associate,
Mm-hmm.
and I was working representing Ford and GM, and I was brought into those cases for other partners that had those relationships with those companies, and just kind of supported their team. And I was really kind of learning
Mm-hmm.
about how to be a lawyer. It's so funny. Even though I graduated summa cum laude from law school, and I graduated from this wonderful trial practice program that was, intended to allow, the young lawyers to hit the ground running. 99% of what we actually do in the practice of law, you don't learn in law school, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you might have a little bit of a leg up on your peers, but there's so much to learn. And you realize that once you're actually, at a firm and actually practicing law. So I was on, a couple of different litigation teams that were representing these automobile companies in all kinds of kind of, I would say, tort type cases, mass torts, and even class actions. So design defect cases involving the placement of a gas tank, of seat belts, sudden acceleration cases, rollover cases, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that for a few years. And after a couple of years, I was about 30 years old, and an opportunity arose for a litigation role in their Los Angeles office. And, I'd lived in Michigan my whole life. I was ready for a change. All of my friends, were basically married at that time because
You're from the Midwest.
What's that?
Because you're from the Midwest.
Right. In the Midwest, everybody's getting married in their 20s. And I was still building a career, and I wasn't super focused on, settling down at that point in my life, and wanted to continue to have fun and explore and experience. And so when
I remember that person.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
You remember me?
Yeah.
When I was in that world. And so I ended up throwing my hat in the ring for a transfer. And 6 weeks later, I was living in Santa Monica, California. I was working out of the Los Angeles office of this great firm,
Mm-hmm.
and starting a new chapter, and it was all very exciting.
Yeah. So, so you were at Dykema in LA, and was there a point at which were you happy with doing that type of practice, or was there a point at which you realized maybe you wanted to be a different type of lawyer, or because you were on the defense side doing that kind of work, it's very different from what you're doing now.
Yeah,
So how did the transition happen?
I was at that firm for a little under 5 years, if memory serves, and I worked with some incredible lawyers, super smart in automotive, and product defect type work, to construction law, to some real estate. Got some exposure to some real estate law,
Mm-hmm.
and just really smart, best in class attorneys who really impressed me. But I grew up in a small, hardworking Midwestern blue collared town, and
It's very
yeah, it was just different from the clients we were representing, and oftentimes the the people on the other side were the people that I would typically, have seen, the more typical of the community members I grew up with,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I also thought that there was probably a lack of great representation coming from the plaintiff side. I like the stories better on the plaintiff side. I mean, some really worthy cases from, brought by people who deserve justice and needed justice. And but for the advocacy, the quality of the advocacy, probably would have had it. And it it just made me want to try something different, and ultimately decided to flip to the other side of the V and work for a boutique plaintiffs firm, representing ordinary people against large corporations.
Yeah. Um, and how was that transition? How were your first few years practicing as a plaintiff's side attorney?
So I'll tell you, I'll go to the very first day. Um, I ended up working for this firm out of Santa Monica, for a lawyer named Paul Stevens, who was a fantastic mentor and still is. You know him well
I
because you
do.
ended up working for Paul Stevens as well. And it's
Mm-hmm.
one of the kind of fun facts we have that we share together. Um, and um, we were doing consumer class actions. So I think I started late in the week, maybe on a Thursday or Friday. And Paul and I ended up having a conversation late into the evening, the first day I worked. And I think it was a Friday, because I ended up taking the full 7-volume set of Newberg on class actions.
Mm-hmm.
And I locked myself in my apartment the whole weekend, and I read every volume cover to cover, because I just felt like I needed to truly understand from a holistic perspective how class actions work, what the purpose is behind them, what are the objectives, what are the kind of pain points.
Yeah, because we don't really learn about class action procedure or law in law school. I didn't. I don't remember learning anything about it.
No,
And so
it's like Rule 23 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure is just glossed
omitted.
over.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
remember learning about it. Certainly not in any kind of detail.
yeah,
And so it makes sense that you did that as you started a class action firm, plaintiff side. I'm like, let me do a quick little study on it. I wish
sure.
every attorney who joined our firm who didn't have class action experience could do that.
Well, they can, and
No,
they
they definitely
probably
can't.
should.
And by could, I mean should. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe we add that to the onboarding checklist. So, um,
Yeah. So you
and that
studied
was
up.
probably the best 48 hours I've ever spent in my career,
Yeah.
was just having that time to really do some deep thinking,
Yeah.
and buck up and get up to speed on all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I ended up working with Paul for a couple of years,
Yeah.
and then decided, at some point, that it was maybe time for me to take a chance at starting my own firm. It was
Mm-hmm.
something that some of my friends and I had talked about back in law school. One of my, closest friends in law school and, through my 30s, is Ed Dubendorf, who uh, ended up going into business we ended up going into business together, started a firm, plaintiff side firm called Red Law, and did that for about 3 years. And it was just really a fun time for us to try to prove to ourselves that we had what it takes to be able to litigate, by ourselves, in a true David versus Goliath sort of a way. And I think, those 3 years we worked together allowed us to gain confidence and, teach one another, a lot about, consumer protection, class actions, and just prosecuting cases, dealing with, difficult defense lawyers, um, trying to understand how to position a case successfully for resolution, or ultimately try a case, which we did. And it was a lot of fun those few years. And then ultimately we ended up kind of going our separate ways. And and then started Clarkson Law Firm. And then you came over and started with me, early in those early days as well. I think within a year. Isn't that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Within about a year.
Yeah,
And
shortly after, yeah.
we built this amazing law firm and life together, which
Yeah.
has been so fun the last 12 years.
Yeah.
So,
okay. So then you started Clarkson. So I want to talk a little bit about some of your most interesting cases. So what of all the matters, well, is there a certain case or cases that stand out as particularly exciting because because in the class action practice, we pursue cases that we often find, we find particularly that resonate with issues that we care about. And so, because we are among those that we're representing, really, because we're among the consumers and the employees and the citizens of the country that are impacted by the cases that we prosecute. So are there any that stand out to you as particularly exciting because they resonated with you personally in terms of your values or your the way you live your life?
so let me start at the beginning of the early days of the firm, and then I'll get into some of the specific cases that I really have enjoyed.
Okay.
So when back in 2014, I would say our focus was primarily on false advertising cases involving foods and beverages and nutraceuticals and dietary supplements, those types of products. And, I would say that really developed a subject matter expertise on those cases, a very narrow niche that I'd say nobody now, I mean, I would put myself up against any other lawyer in the country when it comes to knowledge of false advertising cases, and how to prosecute them successfully. So, and that's because it's what I've been spending most of my career doing. But since that time, and particularly in the last, I would say, half decade, I've really branched into other adjacent, complementary adjacencies in terms of practice areas. So a lot of my focus now is on artificial intelligence cases. I've leaned into healthcare. I've leaned into some, labor and employment. I've leaned into, um, you know, um, work involving fertility cases, some sexual assault work, directed at specific bad actors. And so it's felt like there's been this constant learning curve that I've been on where I've tried to make myself uncomfortable by stretching the outer bounds of my knowledge and experience. And so it's been a fun ride over the past 12 years to broaden my knowledge base and my experience. But it all started with false advertising cases. And so some of the early cases involved issues that from an outrage perspective are probably on much lower on the outrage factor scale. So cases involving empty space in food packages, something called slack fill, right? Um, you know, Probably not as serious as AI psychosis and healthcare fraud, or the theft of authors' copyrighted works, or you know any number of other types of work we do today that feels very serious and very important and very outrageous. You know, experiences of survivors of abuse that hire us to help, reclaim their voice and hold, offenders accountable, or, you know, couples on their IVF journeys who, lose their future families as a result of the negligence of another, right? I mean, those are super impactful, important, serious cases that have life-altering consequences. Um, a far stretch from some of my early work. Um, but as far as consumer protection and false advertising class actions go, the importance of uh, a well-functioning marketplace, of consumer choice and transparency, of fair competition, those are the principles that guided my early work. And so slack fill type cases, right, are an example of that. And 12 years ago, it was egregious what food and beverage manufacturers were getting away with. Some of our early cases involved movie theater boxes of candy, right? With
Mm-hmm.
all the, half of it or more was empty space or 2/3 empty space. And we prosecuted a whole line of cases. If you go to a movie theater today, to the extent that anyone's going to those, or if you buy them, those boxes in a convenience store or a grocery store today, they are packaged very differently as a result of our work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing goes with all kinds of food products and beverages. And this is, you're still very much in the thick of this. You know this better than anyone. Those cases are super important. And so early on, we were doing some of those cases that I thought were a lot of fun. Also early in the the early days of Clarkson law firm, I was representing hundreds of families who were victims of a particular class of antibiotics called fluoroquinolones that caused permanent and disabling nerve damage. And I had a woman from Arizona who was like one of the top government officials um, in Arizona call me up when I was, it was me and Ed at the time. We were kind of wrapping things up, um, and she said she had this experience taking this particular brand of antibiotic that was originally created as a prophylactic measure for the troops in the 90s fighting in the Gulf War. And it was intended to help them deal with biological and chemical agents and that sort of thing. Um, and after the war was over, there was this whole class of drugs that Johnson and Bayer Pharmaceutical had that they were looking to create a market for. And they did. And through this advertising and marketing campaign, it ended up becoming, in the late 90s, the largest class of antibiotics prescribed. I mean, tens of millions of prescriptions. The problem was that, and we discovered this because there were soldiers coming back from fighting in the Middle East with something called Gulf War syndrome. Well, that ended up being caused from these drugs, these antibiotic drugs that they were taking, and a certain percentage of people just don't have the particular chemicals in their body to metabolize those drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And it would cause, you know, problems with mitochondrial DNA. And it would cause the sloughing off of the myelin, myelin, covering over their nerves to the point where it would feel like they were having electric shocks all the time. And they couldn't work and they couldn't move in some cases. And there was no treatment for it. And anyway, all this was explained to me by this woman who came out to visit me. She said she had spoken to 100 other lawyers. No one would take her case. And I ended up having her come out. We locked ourselves, again, another weekend, just digging into a particular issue. She showed up with a car full of bankers' boxes with her husband, and we went through everything. And after that meeting, I thought, okay, I am willing to take on these cases. How many clients do you think you could, how many others do you think we could get signed up in the next few weeks? And I think I had 500 or 600 clients within, uh, within the next, I don't know, couple of months. So then I thought, what am I going to do with these cases? I mean, I can't, Ed and I can't prosecute these ourselves. And we ended up, um, I had a conversation with a couple of the leaders in the mass tort world. And I ended up getting on the phone and having a conversation with Russell Budd of Barron and Budd. And after about a half-hour conversation, Russell said, okay, I want to work on these cases. We'll take them on. And he just mobilized the whole mass tort machine behind it.
Yeah.
And it
those
became,
those were the first cases to be filed, right?
Those were the first cases to be filed, and ended up being, like, as I understand it, tens of thousands of filings involving that particular issue, all of which ended up getting resolved some 6 or 7 years later.
Yeah.
But that was so impactful and formative in my career because it was an opportunity for me to get to know real people and their relatives and visit in their homes and speak with them regularly over many years.
Yeah.
It's so funny, my mother was my first employee in starting this firm. And she would be on the phone all day, every day, speaking with all of the fluoroquinoline clients. And it was almost like Erin Brockovich. She knew every single person's name, all their relatives' names, their phone numbers by heart. Could you imagine? And Pammy was just like full on Erin Brockovich. And it was really a fun time.
Yeah.
For me in my career and for us working together and then ultimately giving rise to this firm.
Yeah. Well, I also, with the fluoroquinoline cases, it must have given you some confidence to know that your judgment was correct ultimately, in that, that there was a basis for liability there, that these were real cases, and that there could be success on the other side. Because I recall you telling me that she had spoken to so many firms and so many attorneys, and no one saw it. No one saw the liability there. And so, and you were the first to take those on. And, I mean, that's great. That's great, foresight and judgment, I think, for a lawyer and for a young, well, you weren't young necessarily, but you were early in your solo career.
I was about an 8th-year lawyer, 8 or 9-year lawyer, which, isn't
super, super experienced.
No.
And especially you had your own firm. I mean, you didn't have that many resources. So that was a risk, and it paid off. And yeah.
Yeah. So, and it paid off mostly in impact.
Yeah.
The positive impact in these people's lives.
Right.
And it's something that I've always thought about as we've had to make decisions, evaluate opportunities, and decide, is this a case we're going to take on and invest firm resources into or not? And just because a client has spoken to, dozens of other lawyers doesn't mean that when it comes to us, we're not going to take that case. We've done that. And I think a great example of it is what's happening with our artificial intelligence work. Those principles of thinking differently and evaluating opportunities through our framework and not through what might be right for some other law firm who does it a different way is something that I think we've carried through to present day. And if anything, we're trying to push further with, right? And so we've taken on a number of cases and become first movers in the AI space as a result of that mindset.
Yeah. Okay. So what about a case that maybe looked, well, I guess you sort of answered that question. Are there cases that have looked unwinnable, and have ended up being one of your biggest victories. I think maybe that's one of them. Are there any others?
I've got one for you.
Okay.
So we tried a case against Farmers Insurance back in the early teens. And it was on behalf of this client, John Rastegar, who, you remember John?
Yeah. I remember this case.
He owned a home in Westwood, and he had a pipe break in his home. And it ended up with tens of thousands of gallons of water that kind of washed down his hillside and knocked over his retaining wall. And it caused about $100,000 in damage. And John came into our office, and this is when I was working with Ed. And Ed and I ended up trying this case against farmers. And it was a whole trial about earth movement.
Right.
Okay?
Whether the policy would cover the damage because it didn't cover it if it was the result of earth movement.
Exactly.
As opposed to the result of the defendant's conduct.
A very broadly defined earth movement exclusion.
Yeah.
And we had briefed the issue, and the judge presiding over the case is Judge Ruth Ann Kwan, a fantastic judge at Stanley Mosque in downtown Los Angeles. And so we end up, how did this work? Okay, so we end up going to trial. We go through voir dire. We do opening statements. We had these great visual aids showing like the thousands of gallons of water, rushing down this slope were the equivalent of, the force of a herd of elephants or whatever. I remember that well. And something that I think resonated with the jury. We did all of our witnesses. John obviously gave his story, and they then moved for a directed verdict.
Mm-hmm.
That was denied, and then they presented their defense, and they renewed their motion for directed verdict, and we ended up arguing that into the night. And it was all about whether this earth movement exclusion, based on the evidence, applied. And we were arguing the night before closing argument, and this motion would have gotten rid of the case after the trial had been presented, but before closing arguments. And so we're trying to convince Judge Kwan that the earth movement exclusion did not apply, and that we could present a case to the jury that sidestepped any concerns about the earth movement exclusion killing the case. And I convinced Judge Kwan that the evidence in the case that had been adduced by the experts we had hired, and the lay witnesses who were kind of fact witnesses who observed, would support the theory, the story, that the pipe break caused the water to pierce the slope, run down the surface of the slope, get between the wall and the dirt, and the force of that laterally push the wall over. And that was how we're going to sidestep the earth movement exclusion. And Judge Kwan said, okay, if that's your argument, I will let you make it. Motion denied. Okay, their motion denied. So she lets us go to the jury the next morning, and she kept us there working on jury instructions and the whole thing until 2:00 in the morning in chambers, I remember. We then, I got home. I was living in Santa Monica in those days, and I think I had maybe a few hours of sleep because jury was back in session at 8:30 in the morning. So we're back ready to give closing statements. And I gave the summation, and that's the story that I told. That's the argument that I gave. And we ended up winning that trial.
I remember.
And I remember Judge Kwan at the end of a very long session the night before, when she had made her decision.
Mm-hmm.
As I was walking out, she said, "Mr. Clarkson, very good job on the motion today." Because, hinting she was going to grant that motion,
Yeah.
but I turned her. And we ended up winning the trial. So I would say that was just a really exciting moment in my career. I learned a lot. I gained a lot of confidence. I got to understand all the moving parts of, how it all fits together and culminates in this kind of big climactic moment of a jury trial.
Yeah. That's a really good example of a case that we, because I was with you in terms of this thinking we thought was unwinnable, and you just pulled a rabbit out of a hat.
It
I mean, you
Yeah,
really,
it felt like that, and Ed did a great
yeah.
job on his witnesses. Um, I remember he gave a killer cross examination on their expert, which was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there were all kinds of interesting things that came out of that experience.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question for you. Moving on from cases. I want to know if you have an answer to this question.
Sure.
What do you think separates a good litigator from a great one?
Oh gosh, we're doing questions like this.
I mean, I'm curious about your thoughts on that. I mean, look.
Let me answer that. Let me just. I'll oblige.
Okay. Thank you. What a good interviewee.
I think a great litigator has to have a big picture perspective, have to understand all of the moving parts of a case. You have to understand what the objectives are and what the leverage points are to understand where you're going to go with the case. You have to have a strong sense of story. Okay. And you have to understand what everybody wants. What's important to all the stakeholders in a particular case. So I could give specific examples of some of these things, but I guess just zooming out and answering your question from like a 10,000 foot level,
Mm-hmm.
big picture perspective and an understanding of how all the moving parts fit together, something that I think can only be attained through experience and prosecuting cases and having 1,000 different outcomes or 1,000 different fact patterns. And all of that is something that becomes, part of the data set that you'll then utilize to successfully prosecute the next case.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions for you.
Okay.
Before we wrap up. What misconception do you think people have about the work that we do, plaintiff, public interest type work?
I think any misconception that the public has is based on what the public is exposed to. And listen, we're litigating against big corporations and corporate interests, and they have all of the marketing and advertising and PR machinery that allows messages to be conveyed to the public. So we're at a huge deficit. We're at a huge disadvantage when it comes to the stories we tell and the exposure we're able to get versus what big corporations and their PR machinery is able to communicate. So I'd say that there's probably narratives out there perpetuated by big corporate interests which are antagonistic to ours, about greedy trial lawyers, about concern about just I guess that probably narrative, that narrative is one that I think tort reform, right? The costs of plaintiff verdicts being passed along to consumers and it only lining the pockets of plaintiff lawyers. those are the types of things I would say are probably huge misconceptions. Um, Listen, we are living in a world right now where there are harms being socialized on on the citizens of our country and beyond, largely driven by huge corporations that are privatizing corporate profits and socializing the harms. They also are in charge of all of the instrumentalities of communication. Think about how we get our information through social media, um, through the traditional legacy media, and all of those corporations have an interest in addicting us to their technologies, and it's causing real harm. But they don't want anyone to know that what they're actually doing is addicting all of us in order to increase their profits at the cost of our well-being, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they are constantly working the airwaves through public awareness and public education campaigns that are intended to deceive them into believing that they are benevolent and that lawyers and law firms like ours are not. And it's the exact opposite. They're just gaslighting the public. But they can do it because they're so powerful and their bullhorns are so far reaching and loud and powerful. So that's
Yeah, and there are so few checks on corporations that public interest law firms really do fill a void that otherwise doesn't really the work doesn't get done
the
through
white
legislation or otherwise.
the
It's
executive branch doesn't want to regulate, and
especially this current administration,
that's
but
right.
throughout
This
the years.
administration doesn't want to and wants corporations to basically have free reign. Very supportive of big business. Legislators, okay,
Yeah.
they there's political gridlock. We've talked about it numerous times already, and what is this, the sixth episode in?
Yeah.
Um, that leaves the courts and we as officers of the courts out there championing the cause of ordinary people against big corporate interests to try to fill the void. And that's what we're trying to do. So there's a big misconception about that. But listen, it doesn't matter if it's, you know, um, a fair marketplace with competition and transparency and consumer choice. It doesn't matter if it is, ensuring that there's transparency surrounding the way in which huge rideshare companies are interacting with customers, um, and the information they share about the harms that they're exporting to their drivers and their riders, and the evils that are perpetuated by that lack of transparency. It doesn't matter if it's big polluters involving energy companies or food and beverage, contaminating our food system, our water supplies, our air, our land. It doesn't matter if it's huge corporations that are thumbing their nose at labor code violations and shortchanging workers in terms of the way in which they discriminate against them, or they don't pay them their fair share that they're contractually and legally entitled to. It doesn't matter if it's these artificial intelligence tools that are being used disproportionately negatively, and unknowingly harmful to their users, their subscribers, their purchasers, members of the ordinary public, the general public. It's a total and complete misinformation campaign that is intended to keep ordinary people in the dark so that they do not avail themselves of their legal rights. That's what I see is happening in the world. And we need to reorient the whole system so that people are on a level playing field with big corporate interests, or else it's just going to continue to be, a further divide. And, I don't know. It's a very serious, important fight that we're in. And
Yeah.
I went on a bit of a diatribe there, but
Yeah.
listen,
Wasn't
it's
quite
how
the
I feel.
lightning round we had planned
Yeah.
on, but I'm glad you
What else do you
didn't
have?
adhere
Well,
to
you
the.
weren't asking follow-up questions, so I was just going for it.
Oh, okay. All right, let's do these next 2-3 questions lightning round style.
Okay.
Okay. But I liked all that. That was good, it was good stuff, Ryan. All right, give me this. Give me this one. How do you know when a case is worth fighting? Not just legally, but morally. How do you know? Is there
Outrage factor.
Yeah.
If you know it in your bones, if you feel it, if it makes your skin crawl, if it's something that leaves you with a pit in your stomach, or with your chest, you know, uh, out, and you're ready to just run through a brick wall for whoever it is that's been aggrieved, that's a case worth fighting for.
Yep. What has decades now in the law taught you about people, both the best and worst of human nature? Lightning
Um,
round style.
People agree on way more than they disagree, and contrary to our perception based on what we experience through social media, um, when you actually talk to people and when people talk to one another, they actually are quite cooperative and see most things similarly. It's just when they're in this digital environment that aims all of the compute power of the world at their lower brain stems and is intended to incite and inflame and promote conflict, that we see the worst of us.
Yeah.
But none of it's real. It's all an illusion. And if we would only get ourselves out of this digital farce, then the world would probably, um, be a much better world.
Yeah. That's a really interesting answer from a lawyer, to say that the one big thing that you've learned about human nature is that people actually agree on most things.
Yeah,
That's
I think it's true. I mean, think about it. Um, okay, let me put it to you this way, Shireen.
Tell me, Ryan.
Okay, so I think about the way in which we're all siloed and isolated within our own digital worlds, similar to the way in which people on a highway are all siloed into their own cars, right? Moving next to one another. And, you get someone cutting another off, and that person like starts swearing and like has road rage and wants to pull over and fight. I mean, would that ever happen in a real unsiloed face-to-face experience? I mean, could you imagine just kind of opening a door and someone, inadvertently walks in front of the person you open the door? Would you immediately just like go up to him and like kick him or push him down or whatever, or you start yelling at him? Of
Right.
course you wouldn't do that. It'd be absolute insane. You'd be a lunatic, right? Yet we do that, when we're in our siloed experiences. And that's what the internet is,
Yeah. Yeah. The road rage analogy. It's good. All right. One last question before my last question.
Your
The
penultimate question.
Yes. Yes. All right. What has surprised you the most about success? What is it, or what isn't it? The success that you've had in the law and with cases. What has surprised you the most about it?
Um, how I measure it, probably. Early
Yeah.
on, I in my career, I always thought of success as material success, maybe, you earn more, you have the ability to accumulate more. And I just don't think about success that way now. I think about it in terms of, and maybe this is just a function of getting older. I'm almost 50 years old, and, um, have had some losses along the way. And I'm, now on the back nine of my life, so to speak. Um, and and so, you know, the finite nature and the temporary nature of everything is much more palpable and real to me now, more so than ever in my life. And so success to me now is measured more in the impact that I can have on other people's lives. So the delivering a fantastic outcome for a client, the relationships I'm able to build with colleagues, the moments that I have with family and friends. That's how I think about success.
Yeah. Okay. Final question, Ryan. If you could sit down with your younger self at the beginning of your career, what would you tell little Ryan?
Little Ryan. How did you know that was what my nickname was? I'm kidding. I was never called that. Well, I would say, you know, maybe what I would say is be patient. Um, it's not a race. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon. And just, continue to make good decisions. And those decisions will compound off of one another. And, you know, the just lead, continue to walk a path that you think is a good path, where you're making good decisions and do it for the right reasons, and it'll all work out. It's kind of interesting what
And Mary
I've.
Shireen.
What's that?
And Mary Shireen. You forgot that piece of advice.
Well, I did marry you, so
Yeah, so you would tell your younger self again, wouldn't you?
I'd say do it earlier. No, we have that happened pretty fast for us, didn't it?
No, I'm just joking. Yeah.
Um, the What I found interesting, I'd say, in just looking back over the past few decades, is that for so much, it feels like I've been living on an exponential curve, right? And over the past few years, things have just, been happening so fast, and all this wonderful activity in my life, personally and professionally. And I think that's just from it's almost like exponential momentum, you know, these good decisions compound, and then, things start to really move. But for so much of the curve, it's flat, right? If you look at an exponential curve, it's like it's flat, it's flat, it's flat. It's like a little bit up, and then all of a sudden it hockey sticks. And now that I'm living on the steep end of the curve of this kind of hockey stick, it feels different than it did during the long stretch of the flat part of the curve. And maybe it's hard to just stay patient sometimes. You feel like you have to go faster, but you don't. You just have to continue to make good decisions, and then it'll all work out. So that's what I would say. Just be patient, continue to play your game, and trust the process. It'll all work out.
All right. Very good. Good advice there. Okay. All right. One more one more question for you. Why don't you talk a little bit about one thing you're looking forward to in the future?
Looking forward to seeing how the firm grows. We've got big plans for the firm, um, and expanding geographically, um, in terms of other jurisdictions, other practice areas where we know that there's a real need uh, to represent real people. And then I would say, continuing to scale the firm. It feels like we are we're still on an upward growth trajectory. So I suspect that across all those measures, we're going to continue to grow and expand, and I'm really looking forward to it. Um, Listen, the mission of the firm, as you know, is to become the most forward-looking, purpose-driven law firm in the world. And that is our moonshot goal, or I guess our North Star. And it's really guided us well. So just continuing to kind of push deeper into the stars, I guess, to see where that can take us. Um, I'm really enjoying the work we're doing today across all these practice areas. I'm just in awe of the skill and experience and wisdom and heart of all of our partners and the rest of our team across the organization. That's really exciting. Being able to have cross-team collaborations and cross-practice area synergies is super exciting. So, we're doing a lot of that these days. And so I think continuing to push and challenge ourselves is going to be a lot of fun. Um, and then listen, I'm also looking forward to seeing other ways in which we can make an impact. I mean, I think there's some things that we can do from a philanthropy perspective. Um, so many worthy causes out there that could use a jolt of energy and support. So if we can continue to do good, or then I think we can do well, and it will allow us to also invest our time and energy into some of these other more philanthropic initiatives as well. So,
Yeah.
what about you? Are you thinking about anything on that?
In terms of what I want to see next or do next?
Yeah. What are you looking forward to?
I'm looking forward to, no big surprise, a lot of the same things that you've been talking about, since we talk about these things a lot, but expanding a bit into other parts of the world sounds very exciting, and impact-wise, like a new frontier, literally. And so that piece is exciting. And look, like you said, the group we have right now throughout our entire organization, front to back, is does such compelling work. We have so much good talent. I'm just excited to see what we all the new cases and all the ideas, and it's just an exciting time.
It really is. Yeah. Good. Well, there you go. Little walk down memory lane.
Yeah.
Peek into the future.
Yeah.
It's been fun. Thanks for all of your questions, and
thanks for letting us all get to know you better.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
You want to end on a rose, thorn, or bud? Rose, bud, or thorn? But I did have a thorn over the last few days that I figured I could talk about. I think it's worth talking about.
This might be our first thorn.
Might be. So I had a few conversations over the last few days where I learned about friends or people I knew that have been recently diagnosed with cancer. And that was it's always so heartbreaking and devastating to hear that news. And so that was a thorn, is a thorn. And a couple of those people are children, which is even harder to hear about.
Yeah, that's so sad.
Very sad. And so I was, and in those conversations, in all three of the conversations that I had where I learned about this, we talked, each person told me that they believe, especially in the case of the kids, because they believe the cancer developed as a result of exposure to some kind of environmental toxin. And because especially with kids, you're sort of thinking like, how does a 3 or 4-year-old or 8-year-old develop cancer so early? What could that exposure be at such an early age? And all three were explaining to me that that's what it was. So either because they all live in sort of agricultural, or at one point lived in very agricultural areas where they use heavy pesticides and herbicides.
Oh my gosh.
And they believe, at least two of them, that may have been the exposure. In the other one, the third one, I believe it was believed to be more of a manufacturing factory type of exposure from chemicals. All to say, I was thinking about that a lot, and that I'm hyper focused on these issues already, environmental toxins and toxins in our food supply and our water supply and all this. And so I'm already always trying to think about how to limit our exposure. But that just, brought it even more to top of mind and in a very sad way. And so I guess, aside from just expressing my thorn, I will say that I think it's something we just always need to be mindful of and try to limit our exposure as best we can. There's been a lot of recent developments in the Roundup litigations, and I know that's something that comes to mind.
Right.
That's why those cases are so incredibly important. The cases involving the Monsanto and their Roundup and all their pesticides and herbicides.
So the Supreme Court just heard oral arguments in the Monsanto case.
Yes.
This past week.
Yep.
And we represented Senator Cory Booker in an amicus brief that was submitted to the court for its consideration. And the whole question presented to the court is whether state law claims brought against Monsanto for failing to disclose adequately the cancer risks of their Roundup products are preempted by federal legislation, specifically this statute called FIFRA, right?
Right. So that we're awaiting that decision now.
Right.
And maybe we can talk about this on a next episode, talk about the Roundup litigations and this recent Supreme Court decision that we'll be waiting on. And
yeah, I mean, let's bring Glenn Danis back, who and maybe we bring a few folks in, but Glenn and Kristen Chapman and Brent Robinson, who are all on our Appeals and Writs Department team, to maybe discuss that issue. I think that could be very interesting. It's a
super important topic.
Yeah, it is. And they have a great way of explaining deep, thorny,
legal issues,
detailed legal issues in a compelling way too.
Yeah.
Which makes them great appellate writers.
Yeah.
Appellate brief writers.
So
I'm going to piggyback off of that thorn, and I'm going to give you a rose. Okay?
Please do.
And I'm going to try to tie these two things together, because I read an article this morning about artificial intelligence. In particular, the Mayo Clinic has developed a tool that can be used for screening pancreatic cancer and pancreas scans before pancreatic cancer has been detected. And the tool is apparently able to diagnose the precancerous cells before pancreatic cancer actually develops. Now, you probably know that pancreatic cancer is one of the most difficult cancers to try to cure, and that the morbidity associated with a pancreatic cancer diagnosis is extremely high, and one of the highest among cancers, as I understand it. So having a tool that would be able to diagnose the precancerous cells so as to take, some action prior to the full development of cancer would seem to be extremely valuable.
Yeah.
So these are the types of AI use cases that we are all in support of. This is what we were promised, right, by the big tech moguls. This is why, they've had, at least early on, broader public support than they deserved, because they said that this was going to be able to be used for to cure cancer, or to identify it earlier, or to help cure disease, or to help with environmental degradation and global warming, et cetera. So this is something that actually excites me about artificial intelligence. and something I think we need to continue to push forward and help develop and support. So having a really positive use case to contrast all of the ways in which AI is harming us, I think is helpful and sets a nice contrast between what we want and what we don't want. So,
Yep. Great.
yeah. All right.
Good stuff.
Is that it?
Yeah. Thank you for ending on that good note.
Absolutely. You're into that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I'm going to read us out. Just let's see here. Is that it? Are we done?
Let's do it. That's
Thanks, everyone. Represent More is a production of We Are Them Media, featuring me, Ryan Clarkson, and my co-host, Shireen Clarkson. Represent More is produced and edited by Marketing for Justice and Q Michelli and recorded live at our studio here in gorgeous Malibu, California. Be sure to subscribe to Represent More wherever you get your podcasts and find us on Substack at representmore.substack.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.